Good. Morning, everybody. Feels like I'm in church. We all get hushed tones before the minister comes in at the time, but hopefully I won't preach. Hopefully I won't preach at you guys today.
Sing a hymn.
So, welcome to the meeting. It's great to have you all here, and it's a delightful southern day. I've been crying to anybody that listened that actually for the first time in a long time I ran around Queen's Park before brekkie, and it's one of the best things you can do in New Zealand, so it's great to be out. We have a full meeting this morning, and actually I think a very good meeting, and I always like to just acknowledge Michael, Patricia and the team for some very good papers. There is the basis of a very good discussion here for the risk committee around the assumptions, and again built on the work around the risk environment. That is a very effective paper, and I just want to acknowledge that. The other thing I want to acknowledge is this committee has spent a lot of time vexed in our relationship with our auditor, and it's great, Patricia, to see that we are on time and that we will spend a reasonable amount of time later in PX looking at the draft annual report, and I'm much encouraged, A, by its quality, and B, the position that we are actually in. I realise there is still some ways to go, but actually again it's great that we are in that position. So very grateful to staff for their work for this meeting. It gives us the chance to do our work as we should be. I need to inform you, as you'll be well aware, that we are live streaming, and so welcome to anybody that's joining us by way of live stream. I don't believe there are any committee members. But if I move to the apologies, we have an apology from Ria. I suggest we sustain one from Nobby for lateness. He is in the building, I understand, or at a meeting, but will be with us, and I think that's his laptop, so somewhere he's going to come and retrieve it, in which case we'll say he's present. I'll move from the chair that we sustain those apologies. Thank you, Tom. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against, it's carried. Thank you. Are there any matters of your personal interest that may or may not impact you in the course of the discussion? Being none, I move to public forum, and I haven't been informed, Liz, of any person wishing to speak. Can we move to the minutes, please, of our last meeting, which was the 18th of July. They're in your agenda, and I'll move from the chair that we resolve the true and correct record. Thank you, Leslie. Is there any questions, comments, accuracy that people would like to make on that? There are a couple, Liz, but I don't need to get worried about them. I think there is a word that there's a couple of words that need to be corrected. Can I just ask one question, which I didn't quite know whether we had met. Under strategic risks, and I'm now looking at page 12 of our agenda, number 6 requests a further report on the strategic risks consistent with the newly defined sources of risk and taking into consideration the risks identified during the Deloitte workshop be presented to the next Risk and Assurance Committee meeting. A, I was struggling to remember what that was, but B, can I ask, have we acted on that request? Is that actually as part of our papers, Andrew? You're hiding behind the pillar there, mate.
So, in response to that, through you, I thought the assumptions is really dealing with many of those strategic risk points, and so I thought we might come up with another one, we might follow up with another one, but I thought for this meeting that would highlight many of the issues that were sought to be highlighted in that paper. I
figured that might be the case. Thank you for that. So yes, that's been followed up on, so even the actions are right. So any other points people like to make? No, in that case I'll put the motion. All those in favour please say aye.
Aye.
Those against, it's carried. Brilliant. Right, we can move into the internal audit and continuous improvement update. Welcome, Peter. Great to see you again, buddy.
Morning, Chair. Morning, councillors. I'll take the report of read. I've got no additional areas to highlight, but one comment I'd like to make about a piece of work the quality assurance team continues with is the processing of council's, the documenting of council's processes using the tool Process Manager, formerly known as ProMap. To date, we've processed approximately 740 of council's processes and procedures. So these are available in the cloud to staff members, and the push behind this is to capture our corporate knowledge and document it, but it also allows for easier onboarding and induction of new staff and to capture the knowledge of those longer serving employees. So that's another area of work that the quality assurance team's been working on.
Thanks, Peter. Appreciate your report again. Gives us a good direction as to where things are going. Do we have questions for Peter? Yes, Grant.
Just with regard to the issues, do we have a schedule of what's being audited and when?
Yes, the internal auditor has an annual plan that has previously been put to the committee, but I can put it together as an annex for the next report.
Well, no, it's probably just when does that come annually to this committee?
Yes.
Right. Cool. And then just, sorry, secondary chair, with table 1, continuous improvement requests, the information management open ones, 25, quite a high percentage. Is that something to be concerned about, or is it? I'd be keen to sort of understand that in a bit more detail.
It's a work in progress with the management team. It's new for them to have internal auditing on this area, and it's mainly working on their maturity framework for information management and ticking off as we go. Noting I had to submit this report over a month ago, so there has been process made since the report was submitted as well.
Right. So with respect to those open issues, that's been reviewed by yourself?
Yes.
And is there anything there that's of concern around protection of information of the public or anything like that?
No.
It's all...
Yeah. It's completeness with Public Records Act, etc. is all on track.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Brian, good question. Look, I do think, Patricia, if you could just note this the next time. One, we do actually have a program for the committee, which we should actually keep as a regular, in other words, each meeting attachment for the committee to know what our plan is for the year, number 1. Number 2, Peter, I think it would be good if we just had as an annex what is the internal audit program. That would be helpful because, as you say, Grant, it's useful just to keep in mind what is the nature of the assurance that we're receiving during the course of the year and is it adequate. So thank you for that offer, Peter.
Yes,
and I'll take you up on that if that's okay. Other questions for Peter? Just a couple from me, man. I was deeply encouraged by the work that's going on around the KPI data audits. That makes a lot of sense given the increased emphasis, which I think is correct from the Auditor General, on our non-financial information. And I take it this flows through into the quality of the information that we're providing in the annual report. It may be more a question for Patricia, but FRS 48 is the new or revised standard for thinking about actually how we show that data and the systems behind the assumptions and everything. Is this assurance review consistent with the FRS 48 requirements?
I think I should take this one.
I wondered if you should.
It is. We have, from the looking at our processes and looking at the standard, we have pretty much been on IFRS or PBE IFRS 48 for a couple of years at least. We've only had to make, at the moment, touching wood, some minor changes for compliance in the annual report. That's still subject to audit, and I suspect they may have different views on a couple of points. But yes, we have. It's to make sure we have that assurance that those numbers that are coming through on a quarterly basis into the quarterly performance reports are accurate, and that was the reason why we've started doing those.
Brilliant. Look, that's great to hear, and I'm looking here, Peter, at the long game. But quite rightly, the auditors should be, as we should be when we get to the annual report, spending as much time on the non-financial information, and there's the clear expectation that we will pay due attention to our systems and processes of data collation and actually our assumptions and what have you behind it, just as we do with our financial numbers. So if over the long term the work you do here picks that up, that would be really good. I'd encourage you to sit down with Patricia and she can tell you everything about FRS 48 you want to know. Look, just again, the continuous improvement program, and I just wanted to check something out here. You praise information management for their proactivity in looking at the Lagoima and proactive release reviews. Can I take the same assumption that solid waste are proactive over the findings that you have made there?
Yes,
Good.
they are chipping away at that one. It's been a change of personnel within infrastructure, which has slowed down the timely action on some of those recommendations.
Yes, brilliant. Can I just check a couple of things here? On the list of continuous improvement requests, we have a couple that seem awfully similar, but again, perhaps it reflects Grant's question, what is the plan? We've got information management maturity framework, and we've got Invercargill transfer station review and Invercargill transfer station as separate line items. So is that a double up, or are they two separate sets of audits over the same area?
The information management are two separate. I will confirm on the transfer station, I believe that's a double up.
Right, even though the recommendations made a different.
Yep.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, sorry, Rangi?
Oh, look, just after you, Chair.
Look, the only other one that I had then was quality assurance. What is that of? Is that?
That's just recommendations internally within the team for changes to our quality manual, etc. And how we do business internally.
So
sort of try to
self-review.
Yeah.
Oh, brilliant. Good on you.
Try to walk the talk when it comes to what we get other people to do.
Good on you. Oh, well done. That's tremendous to actually hear. And sorry, Rangi, I'll get you, but I just want to check one other thing. Under table 2, the infrastructure contract compliance. Can you just remind me what that is? That strikes me as a relatively important review. And we've got a good number of recommendations coming out of it, man.
It was the review from the external audit partner on the compliance, mainly focusing on the waste management contract.
Yep.
And the compliance on all parties with that contract. And it's a work in progress. There's been a change in infrastructure operations manager, which has slowed down the progress on those.
Right. Okay. I mean, look, again, in terms of information sort of value, you've always characterised the outstanding risks, and they're moderate, and they're not at least major or significant or extreme, but 16 moderate, particularly if they relate to one contract, suggests this needs a wee bit of focus. But I hear your point that you've had staff changes, and so it's slowed, and I'll be looking for progress in the next one, which would be great.
Yes.
Rangi, you've got a question, buddy.
Yeah, look, you've raised 2 items on the transfer station, and then in table 2, the infrastructure contract compliance. Now, as chair of infrastructure and also on the WasteNet committee, we are totally unaware of this. It's not brought to our committee agendas. So is this appropriate that we only find out about it here, or would it be appropriate that we briefed in those appropriate committees?
Well, firstly, Rangi, I'm not having a crack at solid waste. Can I say that? I just
No. I'm just saying
that's in front of me.
Being awareness of it. That's all.
Can I? The answer is yes. I would assume your committee would know all about this. Okay. And perhaps when we get to my review of the committee, we might want to re-raise this question, because I think one of the work-ons that is needed is actually the relationship of this committee with the rest of the council, because we are doing valid work here, which is we are asking Peter and indeed our Deloitte's to work on a internal assurance program. I would have made some assumption that you would have been aware of this, but equally, you're here as chair and you've got a chance to see that we're doing good work in this area. But equally, you probably want to be briefed on. I would have thought. Yes, Michael.
Yes, thank you. Through yourself, Chair. That will be in relation to the fact we've had those staff changeovers, and the person who was tasked with a lot of the actions is the one that's changed over. I would hope that this will be taken through to WasteNet in relation to giving them the same information that we'd be able to share with this council. So, to my knowledge, it's only been highlighted. they have not had the detail at this stage. So we'll rectify that, and we'll actually take our own team out there to disclose what we've done as an internal audit to them.
Would that be more appropriate for WasteNet being the Invercargill transfer station or through the infrastructure committee?
You can have both if you would like, Councillor.
So thanks for raising that, Rangi. As I said, you'll find fertile ground discussing that with me, because I'm very interested to see how the work of this committee, which is important and needs to do its work, but how does it provide confidence to the rest of the governance groups, council, that actually things are okay, rather than there being an assumption. Thanks for that. Peter, believe it or not, that's my question, but Grant, I think you are next.
Yeah, thanks, Jed. So just, Michael, so what I think I heard you say was that it hasn't been reported through infrastructure because someone's not in the position.
Through yourself, Chair, yes, the intent was that the infrastructure operations manager would be taking that and presenting that through. We've had a vacancy in that role for a couple of months. That has now been filled. So we'll be in a position now to, as soon as they've taken on board the recommendations, be able to present those up, so that can be rectified pretty quickly. So
is that a common practice, that our reporting and assurance program is reliant on someone in the role, i.e. we haven't got a process that sits there irrespective of who's in the role? So, because I would have thought that there's a process that says it comes through infrastructure, and if there's someone not in the role, someone else does that, but it still goes through the same process. It's not dependent on the person, but the role being someone holding the position. There should be a process for where, particularly, assurance and compliance goes to.
Yeah, through yourself, Chair. Normally there would be, in this case, all internal audit and external audit need management comments and feedback. We weren't in a position to be able to impose that on the incoming person without them having the chance to review through those actions. So we'll give them time to actually look at those actions and put the management comments to come back. If they come through, there are times when some of those continuous improvement actions aren't actually required once it's gone through the management comments, because there may have been something missed. So we actually need to make sure that management has time to digest and actually provide feedback in relation to those actions.
Yeah, sorry, it doesn't give me any confidence, because what I'm hearing is it's still related to if management let it go through, or there's management there that can comment on it, then the committee will see it. It should be that the information goes to the committee. If there would be a comment put on the report that a manager hasn't been able to review it, or a substitute manager has, because if that's the way we're doing compliance and assurance across the organisation, it's got a few holes in it.
Through yourself, Chair, no, we provide both sets, so you get the comments directly from the audit, internal audit or external audit, and you get the comments from management. In this case, there is no management, at the moment there's no management comments available because there's no manager there.
No, but we're talking about why it hasn't gone through Rangi's committee.
If I can step in here, typically we haven't been taking this particular one that we've referenced actually came to this committee at its last meeting with the executive summary, if I remember correctly. We typically don't take them back through a second committee unless the chair would request them to come through, which is what Councillor Pottinger has asked now, because this is the committee that deals with the matters in that. So because you get double up if we were to take the findings from an internal audit back through two committees, because that internal audit program is the principal part of this committee.
Well, I mean, we've got the three chairs being myself, Darren and Rangi here of the respective committees. I certainly know from finance and projects I'd like to see them through my committee before it comes to this committee, and I think Rangi's saying the same thing, and I'm sure Darren would say the same thing as well.
Let's have that debate. I mean, this is driven by our Audit and Risk Committee. Okay, and your assurance program is driven off, should be driven off a sense of what are the risks. Again, that's something we'll come back to when you look at my review of the committee work program, so that we are a proper risk and assurance committee. Having said that, I think there is a good reason, Peter, that we and the issue's not yours, by the way, is actually to understand your process in terms of once you're doing your work, what is the process to get that report cleared before it comes here? I think equally, and I've tried to signal that twice now, when we get to my review of the committee, you'll recognise that I am saying the connection between this committee, your committee, Grant, and the others is a work on, in my view, and I think the discussion we've had shows that it is a work on, and we need to solve that reasonably quickly. Yes, Darren.
So can I just clarify then, what will come through our committees are the performance reports. What's coming through here is the audit of those performances.
No, I think we're saying, and I think we need to keep it simple. We want to have a risk-driven internal assurance program. And Grant, at the start of the conversation, asked what is the annual program that we have, and we've asked Peter to help us as a committee by just annexing the program as a standard item behind this paper, and that should be driven by a combination of the executive and this committee agreeing to an internal audit program annually. So that I would suspect needs to be tightened up, but it doesn't matter. That's number one. So number two, the reporting of Peter's work, or indeed Deloitte's, our external providers for their work, is with the people that they are auditing. So that would be the solid waste manager, and to report to this committee. I think Patricia probably has shown the key, if we're doing it formally, are there grounds for us to resolve that this report go to the subject committees?
Sorry, I don't think I was clear. The performance of those different departments comes through our committees, whereas the review... Oh,
you're making the same, what do you do? Yes, thank you, sorry, mate. Yeah, I preached it, you didn't know. I said I shouldn't be a preacher today. Yeah,
God, no.
Yeah, no, I appreciate your point. Okay, so I sense a wee bit of unease about this, so we need to work on this one, and I'll well, again, let's just perhaps work out whether there's a couple of actions that come out of my review of the committee's work, because I suspect this could well be one of them, Patricia, that we should have as a work on. Right, Leslie, thank you.
It's okay, Chair. You actually made my point that I thought this was a discussion we were going to have in the next section.
Good. Right, in that case, thank you, Peter. It shows you the relevance of internal audit. So can I move us to the recommendations, which is that we receive a report. Have a mover and a seconder, please. Thank you, Grant. Thank you, Leslie. Is there any discussion on the motion? Being none, I'll put it. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against? It's carried. Thank you very much. Thanks, Peter. Appreciate that, man. Right, if we can move indeed to the item. You might recall this was held over from the last meeting, mainly because I think I was late for the agenda, to be perfectly honest, and I didn't want it to come as a late item. What I would like to do is just essentially open up the conversation, but I think probably for me to work through my slides super quick would be helpful. I've always said that we should annually review. I think we did in the prior year. We had a short survey of staff and councillors in terms of their thinking. In this situation, I have done a self-assessment, if you will, of where we're at, and I have thought it useful to do a couple of things. Firstly, where we have come from, and essentially on my first slide under or after purpose, I'm reflecting a change emphasis, and indeed the conversation we've just had is symbolic of where I want this committee to go, in my view, which is that we do normal risk and assurance work. The work that we were asked to do, and with reasonable rationale behind it, there was a broader focus on this committee, and you've seen there under the changed emphasis of working together, which is at the stage when we had Grant and Lindsay with us. There were some big issues that you can see there around ICL block, and obviously the legal claim. And quite frankly, we've had too much time spent with our auditor trying to get an audit out of the way. That's still valid work. That's all valid work, actually, because they all reflect risks. But having sensed that, the program this year is one where we are trying to be a more traditional risk and assurance committee. Can I say, I think personally, my assessment's got a wee way to go, but that's neither here nor there. So look, I've just wanted to reflect under the program and focus my appreciation, in effect, of your attendance. It's been great and regular, and we've had additional people here. I think the thing that I'd want to reflect is, again, as I want to do, I do reflect the paper's qualities are improving, and I appreciate that. And I'm very appreciative that we're getting the financial risk update, the omnibus one, which has been an important inclusion that you've brought, Patricia. However, I do think if I was to move over to direction setting for 23-24, I'm reflecting here what I consider to be probably the three key areas that we should look for development in this current year. The first one, and I call it the centrepiece, is nailing our strategic risks. Andrew is taking us through a process, and we see the fruits of that today when we consider the assumptions in terms of looking at the risks around our strategy. But believe it or not, there is still work for us to do to complete. What are our strategic risks? What's our risk appetite? And actually starting to govern as a committee based on those risk assessments. Because if they're real, we should be driving the use of our resources by it. The second thing is actually just what we talked about, an effective internal assurance program. Our role is to be aware of the risks and to also be able to give governance, you and your colleagues, assurance that we've got these things under control. Or whether actually we're outside of our risk tolerance, in which case we may have to recommend that there be action. And the third point is, perhaps I should have put better after our discussion this morning, ongoing communication with the full council. Because in my experience, this committee doesn't have a strong relationship, other than through you folk, in terms of the messages that this committee could be giving to the broader council. So I noted a couple of other points right at the end there. We do struggle to weave it with time, and you might want to have a crack at me over that, but I'm fronting up. And there are some things that I would like to see more regularised, which is time with, firstly, Michael. It would be conventional for a risk committee to have time with their chief executive on risks. It would be normal for a committee to have time with the auditor. External auditor we do. And actually, I want to reflect, we should also do the same with our internal auditor. If we understand the role of the internal auditor, they have a quasi-independence inside an organisation, including the ability to talk direct to our risk committee. So those are some of the areas that I would like to move the committee into. Hey, so that's the Robertson self-assessment. I'm very open now to discussion and comments from folk if they would like to make it. Yes, Rangi.
So looking at our governance statement and where the Risk and Assurance Committee sits in its definition there, yep. How do you feel about that? Do you believe our governance statement actually sums up the role correctly? What we have there, because there's actually more written about the role of the Risk and Assurance Committee than the other standing committees.
Yeah, yeah.
It's quite complex. So is it overdone, or is it right on the money?
I think it's reasonable at this stage, Rangi, and I'm also trying to drive my assessment of these changes through quite frankly, my experience of what is good practice. And I would reverse engineer it. I haven't looked actually at the governance statement, but I'd come back and reverse engineer the governance statement if it isn't fitting for us. Because
it does state that, I mean, obviously it's a relationship with council and also other committees. Now, like we have joint committees, WasteNet's one of them.
Yep.
So would this committee have have that relationship with WasteNet and the risks involved, or?
I mean, you raise a good point. In short, I think we need to, well, put it this way, let me back the truck up. We have a responsibility for group risk, okay? The risk of the Invercargill City group, not just the parent. And we've been well served by that through Andrew, and indeed, for instance, the development of the ICL block. And we have been aware of the risks and the development in the course of, well, actually the last couple of years or so, as that has progressed. Why? Because we should have a responsibility around group risk. So to the extent that actually the joint committees, and you've mentioned WasteNet as a particular, if that is a particular strategic risk, the answer would be yes, we should.
And just taking it another step outwards, Great South. Now we are a shareholder of that, in the sense that we're a shareholder of Polco or whatever. So obviously risks involved with that. Is that something that we need to be aware of, or do we just separate ourselves and let it happen?
It's a good question, and it depends on the relationship, but I would argue that we should have an increased relationship with those entities that are our CCOs.
Right. Okay.
Being quite definite. So let me give you an example. Auckland. We meet quarterly, or we have a quarterly report from all our CCOs on their risk environment and profile. And every quarter we have one of them in to talk to us about their risk profile. So the reality of it is, yes, there is significant room for us to have, as a committee, for the benefit, and I want to stress this because it goes back to the communication issue, for the benefit of whole council to have a more effective relationship across the group.
But would it delve down to their compliance, or do they have their own? They have their own audit mechanism themselves.
I would be expecting to understand for any CCO, whether it's ICHL or whatever, what is their own risk management and assurance approach, and what are their risks?
Okay, no, that's enough.
Rather than this being a vehicle to question their performance, that would be dealt somewhere else.
No, it's about compliance. Yeah.
Yep. Tom.
I think actually to some extent you've just said what I was going to say, which is that while you've raised a specific point about risk and assurance committee, I think more broadly a question for this committee is as to what extent are councillors in particular able to understand from information that they receive the totality of what's going on in the organisation. And I think that is a very valid question. I mean, to partly answer it, every councillor receives every agenda. Every councillor receives the minutes of every meeting. You can therefore say that if sufficient work is done on those by that councillor, then they can piece together all the little bits and put it together into a jigsaw. But there is no opportunity to get a kind of overall view from, say, the chairman of each committee feeding back to council, and neither is there an opportunity for the chief executive to give a state of the nation to council, which is, and I think both of those things actually are lacking in my view. Again, coming back to the question, how does an individual councillor collect all of that information in the form of pieces of a jigsaw puzzle and actually put it together in a jigsaw puzzle, which, without the opportunity to ask those questions. So I think, well, you've raised the matter with respect to the Art Committee specifically. I think there is a broader question, which is actually still part of the work of that committee, to think about, how do we minimise the risk of lack of communication across council as a whole by the fact that we don't do those things. We don't have face-to-faces with chairs, for example.
Thank you, Tom. Appreciate that comment. Agree. Any other comment folk would like to make? Yes, Rangi.
Look, just following on to what this committee does, it states in our governance statement for this committee that this committee periodically meet with ICHL and group. Now, this committee this term has been going 1 month shy of a year, and we have not met with ICHL. And I'm just wondering, like, are we, is that supposed to, again, that's in our governance statement, and I'm a great believer that whatever we have written in our governance statements is correct. Otherwise we take it out. So that particular statement, meeting with ICHL, and obviously there's a heap of risks with what they do. What's the state of the nation there? Do we?
Andrew, I look like you want to burst into song, so I'll let you have a crack.
To a certain extent. So two things. Sorry about my voice. Two things as a general proposition in terms of those formal, almost quarterly or 6 monthly, however you want to say them, catch-ups. They've been held between ICHL and Council because the starting point is that Council or ICHL reports to Council directly. I think this was specifically referring to during the ICL development, and we did have the report coming up from the holding company to this committee around ICL. And I think that was, at least in my mind, addressing this question because there was a clear line during the development phase. We switched that though with this new committee structure where that reporting, as it's gone from development to operations, has gone over to finance to be reported to that committee. And so it's probably it's a good point to pick up. We should review that, see whether or not we want ICHL to continue to report here in its own right, and or what we're doing with that ICL reporting.
But it also states, next paragraph says, this committee needs to be briefed on ICHL's annual report and the results of its annual external audit prior to the committee approving the council and the group's annual report. So that's another part that...
So I can answer that part. When we actually bring the annual report through, there is a section in that report that says this is the result of what's happened from the ICHL group.
So it's not ICHL presenting to us, because that's what it says in the governance statement.
Well, ICHL are often in the room via Andrew or via Luke, but not specifically because it's been pulled into the council report.
Let's not extract too many hen's teeth here. I agree.
No,
I agree with the Rangi. The answer is yes, we should.
Yeah,
we haven't. So that's my, that's what I'm wanting to reflect here. I didn't put that down, excuse me, directly as if I had 3 points to improve on, which is the direction setting that I had put there. I wouldn't have included that. I mean, it is one I'd love to knock off. But the critical thing is we need strategic risks, we need a quality internal assurance program, and we need better internal communication. In that, I would happily pick up these other issues as well, but I'd want us to focus on the top three in my view. We nail those top three this year, we are in a better position. But I agree with you, the governance statement says that, and I would personally, you can see from my background, and I've mentioned already a council as an example, I'd like to see exactly what that governance statement says. Okay, I think I have got Grant, then Leslie. Was it the wrong word? Yes, Grant, then Leslie. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. So, it's been talked a lot about risk maturity in this organisation, and I think we need to determine, what the purpose of this committee is.
Excuse me.
And fundamentally, I think it's about whose responsibility is risk, and the answer to that is everyone's. It's just at what level around monitor, manage, and control. And so I think the first thing this committee needs to do reasonably quickly is define how that is going to be done at different levels, so that we don't overreach, but equally as members of the committee, we don't sort of, and you've highlighted it, Chair, have a CCO come in and we use that as an opportunity to interrogate around something that is not anything to do with risk relative to this committee.
That's right.
And, I think if we can get to that point, then the level of maturity we've got in the organisation is enhanced significantly. So I think our role is to say to ourselves, how are we helping the organisation get more mature in its risk at every level? and that's the first piece we need to get the work done on, define our purpose, and then determine, okay, what does it look like managing risk as a lifeguard at Splash Palace versus, you know, the water treatment station versus financial risk with some of our CCOs.
So I think, look, I'd like to make a comment on that if I could, Grant. Agree.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the phrase I go by that is helpful for us is we are risk governors.
Yes.
We are not risk managers.
No.
This boy is the chief risk
That's
manager.
right. Yeah.
Our role is to ensure that he is managing risk. So it's not. Sorry, I keep pointing at you, mate. It's the old story, isn't it? We don't get involved donkey deep in the management of risk. That's not our role. We govern. And so the question becomes, what are the information flows around risk that should come to this committee that enable us to govern? That's the critical build. That's why my first point here is developing our strategic risks, moving us into risk governance is the critical thing, along with hello assurance and communication. Agree entirely. We want to know that risk is being actively managed through our management team. Out of interest, what it's worth, for me, that puts a lot of focus for us on ELT. Leslie.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And thank you for the paper. It's good to have the reflection and the direction setting. Look, trying to put it at a simple level, one of the reasons I am always interested in being on risk and assurance committees at any organisation I'm on the governance board of is because for me the risk and assurance committee is the governor's protection, if you like, against those things that should or are keeping us awake at night. That's why I'm really pleased that you've got the identifying of the strategic risks so high on your list, because I actually believe that's the absolute core. It's those, what should keep us awake at night, how as governors do we ensure that we do have a handle on it. So I was very pleased to see that as the top thing you had identified. And then the ongoing governance, I agree, we can do, as we've already discussed, a bit to improve the communication and the match up between the committees, this committee and others and so forth. But look, for me, the absolute concentration on identifying those strategic risks for us as governors is the essence of what this committee is about. If we in 23-24 actually achieve that level of identification of strategic lists to the point that all of us on this committee and all of council feel that we have a handle on those issues, particularly the top ones that keep us awake at night and how we are prepared for them so that there are no surprises. I think that alone is a huge mark of success for this committee. So I just wanted to say thanks for the paper, thanks for the clear setting out, but for me that's the absolute top.
Thank you, Leslie. Going around the committee, I might see Nobby, Darren, Ross, you're welcome to make comments as well. Right, it looks like you've got some comments, Nobby.
Sure, just listen to the comments. I think there's a potential here to overreach this committee onto too many things. It's a little bit like audit, the discussion we've had recently with audit. You just keep topping it up, and every time you get an area that you feel uncomfortable with, it goes to the risk committee, and the next thing you know, full council is doing nothing but rubber stamping the outcomes or the reports of things. I think risk is the biggest thing we face as elected members publicly, and yet we've only got half our elected members here on this committee, as you can see. And so one of the things is, by the time this gets to the full council and gets received, as I think Tom said, some of the councillors won't have read it. That was the first thing, but even if you do read it, the minutes are not reflective of a lot of the stuff you just discussed. It'll just be an oversight, and that's we've made those decisions with the committees that we won't detail verbatim everything because the minutes get way too long. So I am a little bit worried about us being too risk averse in the framework going forward. I mean, I raise with you, what is the committee actually doing, or what should it be doing? I would like to think that we have an annual identification of what's strategically at risk for us going forward. We could identify some of those things. Now, I guess the cost-wise, so that these meetings don't become all-day affairs, would be that we'd have to acknowledge that some of the reporting that currently come to us regularly, and it's all okay, that we should just let that slip. So instead of having a 2-monthly report, maybe we might just get a 6-monthly report, which makes space for the stuff that's strategic. I think we should also, touching on what I caught up with what Grant and Rangi were talking about as I came in, was, we should have an ability also for the chairs to raise a risk that comes past them that's not necessarily on this agenda. And I could think of a couple recently. So the chairs could say, actually, that needs to go through. And we have space to be able to accommodate that. I think that would be helpful. I'm not sure whether we're mature enough to take the CCOs and just talk about risk without getting into other stuff. So we'd have to be very disciplined in that, because otherwise this committee will be all encompassing. And like Andrew said, we made decisions early on that Holdco would report to Grants Committee, which is finance and projects, and that's where it should still go. But the risk aspect of it probably still needs to come here. But the flip side of that is just about every paper I see going through just about every committee's got an element of risk in it, because the staff, quite rightly, we've asked them to do that. They put in the financial implications of the paper. They also put the risk in there, and it's rare not to have some risk. So you don't want everything that's got risk to come past this committee. I mean, we'll be here all day and then some. So I guess getting that balance, I guess, would be helpful. I'm very in favour of the quarterly reporting of risk from the CCOs. I think that would be helpful. I'm not sure about the chairs and the chief executives doing a state of the nation, because that is much wider than just risk. I think they should be reporting to full council, and we don't get that at the moment, but we should have that at full council level. Otherwise, full council will do is just reinforce minutes from all the meetings, including this one. That's my penny's worth.
Thanks for that, Nobby. Look, I appreciate that. I don't think you and I are too far apart.
No.
And in fact, I hope actually you've mentioned the word overreach. I'm trying to make certain that we indeed do what our role is, which is, as the title says, risk and assurance.
I guess what I was suggesting is risk is everywhere.
Look, it is.
It's a little bit like health and safety. It's everywhere.
Agreed. But I think what I want to reflect again, I mean, I'm sensing that potentially even a short workshop on risk management for us, just the discussion, the Korero would be not a bad thing. I want to reflect that I agree, and I presume all your council papers do have a section, for instance, a section around risk.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean to say it suddenly gets sheeted home back to here. What I want to know is actually what is the maturity of thinking of Michael and his team as they fill out that risk section. It's a systems issue that we need to know, because that is evidence for you. Are staff thinking effectively about risk? None of those, few of those need to come anywhere near here unless they are strategic. The other thing which I think is really important you raised, Nobby, if I could, while we're talking about risk, is indeed your point that actually not only should we be dealing with strategic risk, and I want to reflect a point that you've made, Leslie, that's the key thing we need to know. And actually, this is the good year to do it, because you're adopting your LTP. So if our strategic risks aren't related to what you want to achieve, those opportunities in the LTP, we're wasting our time. So it's actually a really good year to get ourselves nailed on that one. But I think actually, again, within the agenda, we should allow for the dealing of emerging risk. Because we're going to have health and safety as a strategic risk. We're going to have disaster preparedness. And I'm about to say they're reasonably stable. They're not if you live in the North Island, and if we're about to go into El Nino, it's going to be different for us. But the bottom line is we should also be aware of emergent risk, because often they can take over and be indeed the strategic risk.
I guess that's what I was coming to, Chair, was just the fact that it seems to me at the moment there's one piece of the jigsaw missing.
Yeah.
At the moment we get standard reports from the risk people.
Yep.
This committee identifies the risk going forward. Michael can do that. We get the risk identified on our reports, but it doesn't seem that the chairs actually say, what's sitting in front of me today is a bit more serious. I think that needs an oversight of the Risk and Assurance Committee, or it doesn't.
Yep.
And we don't seem to get any referrals that way. This is where it should be, I think.
It doesn't mean we don't think about it, though.
No, I wasn't saying that. No, not at all.
Right, I wonder if I could get us to, oh, sorry, have we got a final, Rangi, you had your hand up, do you want to make a final comment as well, Grant? I'd like to bring this towards a conclusion, where I'll try and sum up, and we'll work out what perhaps I've got to do.
Look, what I wanted to raise was, is it a role of this committee to go over, for the purposes of preventing the same mistake happening again? And I want to bring, and I hope no one interrupts me here, is the litigation against Sir Tim. Now, is it the role of this committee to learn the process we went through, purely the process? Because obviously we started off with a QC, got advice, and then we went on a merry dance and insurances and stuff, and then we ended up doing that. Is that something the committee would learn from, or someone would learn from, obviously, to at least be in a better position, say, next time it may occur? I'm just wondering if that's the role of this committee, or is that ELT just doing it separately? I mean, obviously, you must learn from things like this. And could we have done it a different way or whatever? So I'm just wondering, is that the role of this committee, or?
Well, look, I mean, probably. Oh, I'm not going to say everybody in the committee's been around this. Actually, it's not. Fair, so we dealt with it in the previous training. The answer is yes. I think we do need to learn from all of these, and indeed some of the stuff that we have discussed in this committee, probably in PX, is stuff that we should be, with our chief executive, thinking through what is the lessons that we have learned out of it. So, in a sense, if we could talk about the legal claim, that was risk crystallised. We had an event. So any good committee, and it's a bit like what we're doing here today, just reviewing our own performance, would look to see what are the learnings out of that. If we were disciplined, that would be the right way. Did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I did. I think Rangi raised an interesting point, because Tim's not the only one. If we had one in the future that we were facing at risk around personnel or something similar, would we repeat the behaviour again? I think there's a place for the chair of this committee to take significant events and do a short workshop where the parties sit down and analyse how they handle it, what outcomes they got to, what would they do differently next time. Otherwise, we just repeat the behaviour.
Thank you. Thank you for your point, Rangi. Grant, and then Ross.
Yeah, thanks, Jed. So just thinking about where to next in terms of the risk to your comment around, how well is Michael and his team overseeing those risks. Yep. Would it be reasonable for us to seek a report from Michael at the next committee, just as an initial sort of cut of that? And I'm thinking about, the report we received from Peter, which, is a good look at assurance risk. The report received from Ua and his team around health and safety. We're on a journey, but what are the other areas, and then what's our sort of level of competence, capability around understanding risk in each of those areas? Would be worthwhile, I think, from my perspective, but I'd be interested in your view and other committee members, just as a sort of initial sort of, okay, well, this is where we're at, and then we can start to get some structures and discipline around how we lift those things.
I'd be very happy to take that one on advice. I don't know whether quite at the moment that we should necessarily have a paper, but I think myself, with Michael and with Andrew, should take this on on board, and we should work through what is the next steps out of here.
Yeah.
Because I mean, I think if I could sum it up, and I know Ross, you still want to have your say. Perhaps we can accept from a self-assessment of pass mark, but could do better. I don't know what teachers would write these days on report. Do they still write reports? I don't know, but perhaps they do. That actually, or I can't put into NCA credits. I don't know. That actually there are clearly some actions that I'm sensing you folk want out of it. I mean, I'm wanting change. And we should try and just capture and crystallise what is the roadmap to improvement. To be honest, that's what we really need. And I wonder whether the three of us should just put our heads together if the committee was prepared to accept that, rather than just think there's an immediate report, which I don't have. You know, I'm agreeing with you, but I think it should be.
Well, that would be suffice.
Ross, and then Leslie.
I take on board the councillor's comments, and without going back, I guess the overreach or the expanded role has become of circumstances over past years, but I think the focus and onus going forward, there's a bit of onus on Bruce and I to get the agenda setting right, which we have a pre-meeting with Michael and Patricia. So I think it's our role to make sure the agenda's right and then encourage the right focus for the papers coming through for this committee, and I think we get that right, we're on the right track without delving into the rest.
Ross, final comment to Leslie. Oh, you, Darren, you've got the final comment, Darren. So Leslie, then Darren. Okay, we're right.
Okay, look, I was just going to I agree with what Ross has just said, but I was just going to make the comment from the other comments, Grant and others. It would seem that your suggestion of a regular slot for the chief executive is probably something we're heading towards, rather necessarily than a one-off report. That regular overview slot, I think, would be useful for this committee.
And I want to reflect, it's obviously I've suggested it, Leslie, and you may comment on it, Nobby. Again, it needs to be risk focused. You know, it's not about you know, what should be going to council or indeed the other committees. This is actually about risk. I mean, my personal preference is I keep it verbal with chief executives. I did have a chief executive would regularly give me a 16-page report, which was brilliant. But I want to make it relatively. I want us to be able to learn to walk pretty quickly. It's simply what's keeping you awake at night, Michael. You know, somebody. I think you used that phrase, Leslie.
Right. That's what I was
which
meaning.
should be focused around risk. And I won't share what other chief executives say, but Michael, I'm sure there may be one or two things. And indeed, it might even be, actually, I'm sleeping well. There isn't anything. It's always an open thing.
What are the chances, Michael?
He's lying if he tells you that.
He tells me every time I see him that everything's going fine. Darren, you've got final say, mate.
It's the pitch with which he uses the word fine. I think I like the tenure of the report. One of the problems that we face, in my opinion, is the word risk. And risk really applies to everything that council does as a matter of its operations.
To some degree.
And there seems to be a tendency to think, well, if the word risk is being used, then maybe it needs to come to a risk and assurance committee, which it doesn't. We're around process rather than the operational side. The operational side is what comes to the committees. And with the likes of the holding company, for example, and those other CCOs, I think our interest, in my view, is how does that reflect on our annual report? How does that feed into our long-term plan? And that's where it sits, rather than having to be across everything.
No, thank you, Darren.
Question.
It's the last one, Grant.
Yeah. So just
I see. No,
have we got a commitment?
This is the final round, guys. You got about 3 minutes, and then I'm moving on.
Just following up that action or the proposed action. So Michael, yourself, and Andrew will sit down and go through and present something at the next committee.
I'd like to suggest, and can I include Ross in that? Sorry,
Ross.
I shouldn't have excluded Ross as you're independent. I think it's important that you lean on us in the way that you said, Ross. I think we should, if Liz, we could have a second point that the chair, and I'm going to consult, comes back with a program to develop the work of the committee for. Well, let's leave it open. I mean, I want to say to the current year that should be the first objective, but quite frankly, we should be looking for 3 years out.
Yeah, that's right.
And it just will, I mean, 80% of that is to will reflect the regular rhythm of what a normal risk committee does, which we broadly have, but that'll come back.
And that'll come to the next committee.
Pardon?
That'll come to the next committee.
Yes. Yep, no reason why not. I can't promise that for the 25th, but the 25th is solely about the annual report.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, but the next quarterly meeting will do that.
I'll just use the other 10 seconds that Grant's
Thank you,
left me.
Yeah. I know you always have the last say.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, hey, don't be like that, Darren.
Two. That was a joke. That was a joke, Nobby.
Yeah, in poor taste. When I think back to the last term, this committee grew significantly. And in part that was because of the dysfunction we had in council at the council level, full council level, that we then moved to a model where the committees were a whole of council, and therefore the risk and assurance became a safeguard that a one-off council wasn't doing the wrong thing. It was another layer of safety. Now that we've gone back to the more traditional model, I think, from my perspective, we've got another level of security there, that what goes to the committees subsequently goes through the full council for a decision. And that avoided, there was a risk in the whole of council approach to make an on-the-spot decision and then go away and think, actually, that wasn't the right decision. So, just reflect.
Thank you. I look and I agree, Nobby. The value of what I have put here as the focus is because I think we've normalised ourselves. I mean, working together is gone in the sense of hopefully the legacy of its thinking and approach is still there, but the absolute implementation was the big focus. We can get past that. We can focus on risk insurance. There goes the recommendations. And look, given it's my report, I don't feel like I should move it. Can I ask somebody to move this? Thank you, Grant. Thank you, Darren. Is there any discussion on it? We probably need to call it a program. Sorry, Liz, I'm glad my spelling is probably, I don't know, somebody's probably found a typo in my stuff. Can I put the motion, please? All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against, it's carried. Thank you. Thank you for that great discussion. It was very helpful and I'm deeply appreciative. I'm glad you take it seriously. It's good. Can we move on to an equally important paper, which is again within the remit of the committee, which is to look at estimates, judgments, and key inputs to the LTP, not the policy decisions that you make around it. That's for full council. So the LTP, and Rhiannon, welcome to the table. I suspect we need to hear the highlights or key points you want to make for us, please.
Kia ora koutou. So yeah, this report deals really with two matters: the process to deliver the long-term plan itself, and then the key underlying assumptions that will are intended to underpin it. So I'll just note the stage that we're at in the process means that these are draft assumptions, and it's important to take them as such. There's still a lot of iteration to go through over the next few months ahead of consultation. My paper speaks to the higher than normal, still continuing level of uncertainty in the environment. It speaks specifically to some things we actually expect to land over the next few months to increase certainty, which may result in changes to the underlying assumptions. So I'll just speak briefly to where we're at in the process. The LTP is on schedule. All of the strategic level workshops have taken place, and the direction which has been given by council has been taken through into the workflow. Pre-engagement has been completed. We've had clear direction from the council right at from the beginning in terms of the vision and the community outcomes, which has been very helpful to officers in terms of developing plans. We're now into the budgeting phase. We'll flag, do expect there to be quite a bit of iteration through this phase, given the impact of things like inflation, the reform environment, expected changes within the programme to maintain compliance. The biggest risks to delivery remain the uncertainty in the policy environment. Obviously, should there be any substantial change to direction following the election to the affordable water reform, resource management reform, local government reform, or any of the other environmental programme policy changes that will impact this council, then we are ready to pivot on those, but there will be expected to be a delay. The other factor is really the ability of officers to deliver what we expect to be an intensive budget round program. Obviously, that relies on individuals that have been tied up with annual report elements as well. There may be a situation that may result that should sickness or anything like that impact, we'll need to look at backup options. It'll be a matter for council to consider how they balance any of the risks in terms of being unable to result in decision making. I don't see that as a massive risk. The council, in my view, has worked well together over the previous 9 months, but there's no doubt it is a challenging economic environment. In terms of the assumptions themselves...
Sorry, I wonder, could I just interrupt you there, Rhiannon? I wonder whether it would be useful just to get questions about process, because I certainly would like a viewer to focus on the assumptions, but I wonder if at this stage, because you've raised some really important, well, they're hurdles. I'm about to say they're impediments. They could be impediments to the process. I wonder if folk had any question about process. You're obviously donkey deep in it, as in contrast to Ross and I, but are there risk-related questions about process? Nobby?
I guess just two reflections on the process. The feedback I get, there seems to be good governance participation at the workshops this round. Last time, Rhiannon will probably remember, you get to the end of the process and you're struggling for a quorum, but there's been good turnout, which is a good reflection. And I also get very good feedback about live streaming the workshops. And that's not just from Invercargill, I get other councils looking at our live streaming of some of our workshops, which I thought was interesting. And I've had quite a few approaches about, you know, how do you make that work and how do you still have the full and frank discussion. So, you know, that's been really positive.
Brilliant. Tom?
I think the question I'd have about process is the fact that, well, you know, those workshops have been great. I mean, I never experienced them last term, but I think they've been very, very good. In comparison with what I've seen on boards, for example. I mean, I think it's an extremely good process. The assumptions that I see, though, in this paper don't really drop out of those workshops. They're drawn from other places, so that if you take, for example, you know, I'm just using this as an example, I'm not going to dive into the assumptions, but if you take, for example, questions like, you know, how much will the population of Invercargill grow? Will it grow at all? Will it grow by, you know, the 5,000 that's seen in here? That decision to make that assumption does not come out of the workshop. The workshop kind of talks around it, but the assumption comes from somewhere else. So it does seem to me that one thing that's lacking in the, and I'm going to look at all of the assumptions, I'd say the same thing about all of them. The actual assumption doesn't come from the workshop. You know, there's no question, what should we assume about population growth? You know, that's never debated in the workshops, and maybe it should be, because, you know, these assumptions are key to, you know, how we take the long-term plan forward, but they are drawn from other places rather than the workshops themselves, I would say. If I look at each of them, I think that'd be true of all of them, actually.
Can I speak to that, Chair? So absolutely, that's why they're being brought to this committee, because they're fundamental to how we manage the risk and build the budget and the delivery. They are important to underpin the model. For example, estimating the population and the number of households within a certain range of accuracy is important to estimate the rating base and to estimate the rating revenue. So I hope that explains to a certain point, but that is why we've brought it to this committee for discussion.
I appreciate they're not workshops, and you've made a good point about that, Tom. But I notice this is the first of at least 3 times the assumptions get visited. Admittedly, they're through the committees, but this is just the start in terms of this broad range of assumptions.
Sorry, through you, Chair, if I can. Yeah. I mean, I just wonder whether an appropriate workshop actually would be to discuss the assumptions. Yeah. Because we don't do that. Will the population in Invercargill increase or decrease? How will climate change affect? I mean, all those sorts of things that are debatable, and we don't do that in workshops at the moment.
Okay, so let's take that on advice about that. That's a workshop question, a process question. I want to thank you for that, Tom. I want to keep it at that because we're going to come back to the assumptions as a committee. So, Andrew, you've got a point.
The only thing I would say, and this sort of goes back to the earlier discussion, really it is the higher level, the assumptions that have more significant impacts that will be debated here, but the lower level ones with less impact would probably not. I mean, you might have a workshop and deal with them, but they would still come up here as to how they're managed, how council adopts the management of the higher level residual risk rating. So it's a bit of chicken and egg, I suppose, but it's the point. This is the first time through. The numbers are put in there from external sources, so council can debate them. Ultimately, they've got to be council's assumptions, and how you get to adopting those assumptions is really a matter for yourselves, whether it's through a workshop or through a discussion here or whatever way works.
Grant?
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, it's a little bit to Tom's point. So just to respond to that comment, I think it's important that the workshops do see the assumptions up front. Now that may change or evolve and get disagreed or whatever, but I think it informs the discussion in the workshops more fully, in my view. And the other point I was going to make, I mean, the workshops have been valuable. It's good to hear the feedback from Rhiannon and others that they have been very well participated at and engaging. It's probably just post those workshops, what's the output before it comes through the committee, so we get a sort of a summary, and certainly from my perspective, just a summary of the discussions, and then there will be the opportunity to pick up around, okay, was there a discussion about the assumptions, or have we moved or changed? Because the purpose of the workshop is to sort of get everyone sort of roughly to the start line, isn't it? And so I think seeing some output before we see it through the committee would be helpful for the attendees, just as a summary, to allow further reflection before it comes through a committee.
Rhiannon, I think you've got a response.
Well, I wonder if the rest of my comments on the actual assumptions will be helpful in some of this as well, in terms of the process and how we've arrived at them and at this point.
I'd like to go there. I just seen a head opened up, and I want to stress back to process. And I've taken these on advice around process rather than necessarily about the assumptions themselves. Leslie, I think you had a point. And
I was really just going to make the slightly contrary point to what Tom had said, that my view of the assumptions was that as they currently stand, they were a mixture of things that had been well discussed in workshops and some external figures, etc. But just because Tom used a few examples, things like the ageing population, the housing issue, the community resilience around the TY point issue, etc. They've all been discussed. The CBD city block development, etc. They've all sort of been exhaustively part of the background of various workshops. So I had seen them, the assumptions, as pretty much a reflection of a lot of the workshop discussion that had already taken place, as well as quite a bit more external figures, etc. brought in. And I was interested to hear a bit more from Rhiannon about the assumptions, but I just wanted to make that point. I don't see them as something that is entirely external.
Thank you. Darren and then Nobby.
From previous LTPs, the assumption around population growth has always been something that's been determined by council. But my question for Rhiannon is it the process of the census this year, and when the figures become available, which is probably not till next year, early into next year, one of those things that holds up what enables us to make a more accurate assumption, because we're running on previous census figures which were kind of dubious anyway because of the fact it was conducted during the pandemic. So is the arrival of those figures one of those things that will help crystallise how we make that decision?
Absolutely, Councillor. So that's what my report also speaks to, the quite a large range of inputs that go into these assumptions, and I'll speak in a moment about some of them landing later than normal due to the uncertain environment that we're in.
Thank you, Ren. I'm sorry, I know I did stop you in your flow, but I'll just keep going. The final couple of questions we got, Nobby, I think, and then Rangi.
Just to, for me, just to reinforce what Grant and Tom have said, I mean, I don't think it's productive for this committee to sit here, and don't take this the wrong way, to go through all the assumptions and drill down and say, how did you come to that conclusion? I think a workshop just on the assumptions, just before this meeting paper comes up, would be helpful, so that for Oaks, like I've already asked Rhiannon privately, how did we get to 19% Maori population, given that the last stats I was seeing say the South Island's 9.8 and Invercargill was previously 17, and we're still working on the old stats. So how we jump to 19, and how do we predict 25? Because that changes your thinking and going forward. And the same for the three water spaces a bit later on. We know that regardless of where it comes, we might need an alternative water supply. So they're the things that we could do in an hour, just to run through and understand the sort of logic behind what the staff are telling us, because this is the basis for the long-term plan. It's quite critical. But if we sit here now and go through all these, we're going to be here an hour later asking a whole lot of questions.
Thank you for that, Nobby. Rangi?
Look, I'd like to accept some validity in the assumptions, and that they're here providing this committee a wake-up call, and Greater Council. And take the household one, for example. It says in 10, 11 years' time, there will be just shy of 4,000 more households, which means 4,000 houses. So isn't that a wake-up call to us, that we sit here and talk about more houses, but talk is not going to get us there in 11 years, and it shows that action is needed. And obviously you got the Te Puawai one that's going to provide maybe 900, but if we've got an assumption that says just shy of 4,000 homes in 10 years and 11 years, then it's a wake-up call to us. I mean, it may not be right on the money, but at least it shows a number that is significant, and that too much talk and not enough action when it comes to freeing up land to build houses is going to catch up with us, and we're going to be in the crap. And this committee should just acknowledge it and pass on that recommendation to council. Oi, and this is what I see this as. It doesn't have to be bang on, but these assumptions are a wake-up call.
Thank you for that comment, Rangi. Can I just ask my final question, and it's a process question, and I'm looking at the page 26 of our agenda, where you've got the table. It looks like current best planning, 28 November seems to be a hang of a big meeting, Rhiannon, where many parts of the LTP process are coming together, correct?
Correct.
So that's a critical stage, and you've indicated in your paper after there are a couple of things that could derail it, and obviously policy decisions, particularly in the national environment, that could or could not flow from the elections are potential to derail that, correct? Derail is the wrong word, because that sounds like a political statement. Could affect the underpinning of what we were at.
So we have a couple of factors to manage that. We're expecting it to obviously impact if there is change, affordable water. The way that we've prepared the activity and asset plans means that we're in a position to change track, moving from 2 years of budget through and bringing other work through. We have always signalled the risk of that is that it increases the chance that we may need to come back and rework, because designing the program for transition is likely to be different to what a program looks like if that transition is not happening, is happening later, or is happening under different circumstances with different elements of Three Waters. But we are in a position to continue. We do have the December council meeting, which is about 3 weeks later. That's our backup for staff arriving. There is, of course, audit implications for Three Waters particularly, but we anticipate there will be guidance from government on how to deal with that, because it will be a national issue. So at this point, we're still happy enough.
Well, I'm confident you've given me a awareness. You've got a couple of Plan A's and Plan B's there, which is important. So that's impressive to see that. Can I just ask, do we, because we run the relationship with her, do we have an LTP engagement letter and fee?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Not yet, as I understand it. Auditor still working through with the Office of the Auditor General about how LTPs will actually be audited.
Chris may be online later, we might ask him where that's at. So that is actually one of the issues, isn't it, is that from our deadline perspective, we have to get an external player, in this case Chris and his team, in here to do work, which is a risk. Might I say that becomes, if we're facing, say, an affordables water risk affects our timeline, I think there'll be 62 other territorials, whatever the number is, that will face exactly the same issue. But it is something I'd be very keen, for the benefit of our little input to this process, that we should follow up on where Chris is at, so that Rhiannon and the team can know that they've got an audit that's tied in. Okay, so that's critical, and then it's probably too far at this stage to reflect too much on the bottom part of that table. It makes sense, but there's a few other widgets to get in place before we get there. Rhiannon, I'm sorry, I did break you in your flow, and I should really need to invite you to speak to your assumptions.
So the report speaks to the number of different elements that have gone into the assumptions, and Councillor Lowe raised the issue of the census. There has been some lower level of accuracy in the forecasts coming out of the census, which we actually adjusted at the time of the last LTP in terms of our 1% growth forecast for population. So we had already factored that in, and councillors may recall that we undertook another piece of work with Invercargill around the last year's annual plan to deal with the greater level of uncertainty around particularly some of the economic but also population assumptions at that point. The assumptions development for this LTP has been slowed somewhat by the work that Invercargill was doing for the whole region for beyond 2025, landing quite late. So we have absorbed that information and cross-checked it against the forecasts we already have, and that's how the population assumptions, including the diversity assumptions, are flowing through. I'll speak to the matter that the Mayor raised specifically around those assumptions, just noting that Invercargill and Bluff do have higher rates of Māori population, and that population is younger. So as the rest of the population ages, that's why what is underpinning that change in population assumptions, and it has been modelled for us by Invercargill based on NZ Stats data. There are a number of other pieces flowing into the assumptions that we are essentially wanting to leave flexibility as late as possible. Some of those are around the economics. We're all aware that we're still in a more volatile economic environment, and economists are kind of preaching caution in terms of looking forward and certain levels of certainty, so they remain higher than expected. In terms of key factors like inflation and interest rates, so councillors should expect some level of change going forward on that. But we are fairly confident of where we're at in terms of the information that we present at the moment. All of the earlier workshops presented information as best as we would know it at that point in time. But as my report speaks to, there are some quite lumpy things that will affect the region that are actually still not landed. Some of them may land before the LTP, and that will improve the quality of our assumptions. Others are likely won't. And so we have tried to put that into the assumptions table in terms of the level of certainty that we have around them and the mitigation and management approach. So I think that I've tried to write my report as simply as possible in trying to give the picture of where some of the things actually, since the previous set of assumptions, are actually better than what was expected in terms of, at the time of writing the last assumptions, councillors may remember we were expecting quite a deep recession. That recession has not actually eventuated, although we do have the cost of living situation that we're dealing with. We've seen some really positive things in terms of international migration numbers and tourism numbers bouncing back much faster than I think anybody, including the economists who are forecasting. expected to see. Also, City Block, the work that that the teams had done in terms of looking at the social and economic impacts, which were the reason that council invested in it, we're seeing those impacts. However, there are some significant headwinds, and we don't yet know how all of those will land, and some of them create a significant amount of uncertainty for council, for example, in the area of economic diversification and the extent to which that will flow through in terms of network requirements, which are separate to network requirements that might be driven by population growth. So Invercargill's network was built for a larger population than the point we have at the moment in time. So we've been able to grow over the last few years without having to significantly grow the network. However, some new industries that may or may not eventuate, depending on where they are actually located, are likely to have impact on the network. So that is something that that council needs to plan for, that uncertainty. Housing's been discussed. The research that's been undertaken by Great South shows that rather than a direct shortage of housing, what we probably have at this point is a shortage of the right types of housing for future growth. And there's still work that needs to be done in terms of understanding just how much of a constraint that is and what is the most useful thing to do about that. So I'll just end noting the uncertainty around the reform agenda and policy changes that will impact both council directly in terms of our operations, but also potentially indirectly in terms of impact on agriculture as one of our key sectors, and impact of wider water quality changes and requirements that will flow through and impact whoever is operating the Three Water system.
Thanks, Ariane. I just wonder if I could just ask, before I open it up, just a couple of clarifying questions. So we've got the risk tables, which again was built around particularly a piece of work, Andrew, you asked us to do at the last meeting, I seem to recall, around likelihood and moderate. So we are in the business here of forecasting, not of reporting about past transactions. And I mean, you're indicating that even from previous stuff, some of the assumptions have firmed up a wee bit, or you've got new information or better information. Can you just tell us what is the importance, though, of the likelihood and consequence assessments for us now as we look at these assumptions?
So, for example, some things are fairly certain. Demography, aging population, for example. We know how old people are now, and so therefore we've got a really good idea of what the age profile of the population will look like. Even if you get a higher level than expected of migration, at a macro level it doesn't have a massive impact, so we can be fairly certain around that. Other things are a lot less certain. Obviously, TY is one of those elements. We haven't actually put in the likelihood yet because we're hoping we will know more by the time we actually get to the point. We don't yet know whether that's going to happen or not. If TY closes or remains open, has been modelled by the economists as part of Beyond 2025. It has different flow-on impacts in terms of the impact on council. If it remains open, it's a minor impact for us. We've put it as a moderate impact if it was to close. And that's not purely from the flow-on impact of a population change in relation to employment or the flow-on impact to industries, but also the flow-on impact to the community in terms of resilience, for example. So where there is a greater level of uncertainty for certain elements, then we may have to invest more in planning for alternative options.
Thank you, and I think that's probably where I'm trying to get to, which is when I see particularly that we've got a moderate or a major consequence, it actually says actually if something happens, and assuming that it's I mean it's either likely, I appreciate there's a likelihood thing as well. I guess I'm trying to get to what is the level of scenario planning we're having to do, and I think the question I also have is I can and have read this line by line, but what happens if 6 of them move? And actually, we have inflation. I I could make a possible guess that 4 or 5 of these might all move in adverse ways. How are we allowing for that in our thinking and our planning?
So I think that's a really good question, and we haven't fully scenario modelled worst case scenarios. I think our response in that situation would be likely to be rework. If AF8 goes off and there's a major earthquake, then we know how we will fund a response to that, but what it looks like, the whole plan would have to change in response. Some other mixes we have are benchmarks and the debt ceiling, etc., which is how we kind of look to measure a risk scenario of a number of those changing all at once. Most of them are not like AF8. They would have a moderate impact when it's looked across the whole council budget. But certainly it is something that council does need to consider, and that's why my paper speaks to the higher than expected level of uncertainty, which is what economists are signalling. In that kind of environment, sometimes council will need to decide, do we need to be more cautious, or shall we carry on with this plan and just accept that in this circumstance we may all be back here much sooner than we had hoped, reworking what our plans are for the future.
Thank you. So I've got Nobby and then Grant and then Tom.
To your question, Chair, I don't see a lot of risk in here, even though some are moderate and beyond. Certainly the climate change ones are always going to come up and bite us, be it a flood or be it an earthquake. I think the big one that really jumps out for me is the water reform, but it's actually not the reform. If we get a right-wing government, and it seems like that potentially that's where we're heading, they will cancel the reform, and I guess what we're left with is the biggest risk. So with climate change over the last 2 or 3 years, we've run a bit short of water, so that alternative water supply for us is huge. It's got an $80 million tag to it. And the other issue is, which Rhiannon quite rightly talks to, is the issue of economic development, which involves some very large players, hydrogen plant, for example, but also aquaculture in Bluff, which will require us to upgrade our water system heading to Bluff, and that's another $25 million. So that's huge, and I think it's important once we get some understanding where the new government's going to go, whichever one's in, that we revisit that one, because that can suddenly put $100 million back into our long-term planning at the fairly front end, and that creates risk for other things that might wrap around it.
Thanks, Nobby. And I agree. We can't plan for every scenario, and you shouldn't plan for every scenario. It's probably the most, what is the most probable next one from where we would hope to be. Grant and then Tom.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks, Chair. So it's a little bit to your point around the, what you expect to see on this paper, and I think it's a very good paper because it starts to sort of generate up the thinking, which is great. On the column to the right, the so what, and I think that's what I heard you sort of start to think about, and that's probably something we need to be thinking about. And equally, to answer your question, Rhiannon, around how do we manage some of this risk, if I think through, some of those big investors coming and needing support from council around infrastructure or network, that to me is something that then would be taken through to, say, finance, and we would start to look at, okay, well, we might sort of ring fence a portion of capital, which might be in our debt cap, or it might be however we do it, so that we can potentially fund that if it comes to pass. And if that starts to your big companies start to come in and start to do that investment, we can then work out, okay, well, through negotiation, are we actually on the hook for that, or is that going to get funded by central government, or will they, do one better term, developers' contribution? But at least from this perspective, what we are doing is we're sort of flagging it in finance to say, well, look, let's keep this on our radar and plan it into our budgeting in terms of our capital program, or how we might fund as a bookmark. And that's how I see where we would start to use some of these flags through to the other committees, as an example. I'd be interested in other people's views on that.
Tom?
So I think the assumptions are credible. They probably represent the kind of central estimate of probability on where we might land on these things. But there is a significant range of possible outcomes, and it's the point I think that you're making, Chair, about to what extent do we do scenario planning. Again, I think, this is something that needs to be understood well by all councillors, and therefore I think it should be workshopped actually. But I mean, if I give just one example, we're assuming, I'm not assuming, the assumption which is made in here is that if TY continues, then population will increase by about 5,000. If TY goes, then population will increase by 4,000. Now, all previous work has suggested that about 2,300 jobs overall in the community rely on TY. You can double the population effect because those individuals have families. So you might say, well, there is a minus 5,000 potential if TY closes. So why do we assume plus 4,000? And that's because through all the just transition work, it's been assumed that new industries have come in to take the place. What if they don't? Right? And we've already seen, 3 significant hits in just the last couple of months through oats, aquaculture, H&J Smith. So scenario planning around what if they don't and what if population declines is a realistic scenario. It is less likely, and therefore it should not be the central estimate, but it's a realistic scenario, and therefore, the reason why I think that some of the downside risk, does need to be great if it's upside risk, but it's the downside risk it probably most concerns us. Does need to be, modelled and again, debated, by full council rather than by sort of 5 years who've turned up at audit and risk.
Thank you, Tom. Andrew, I have a feeling like you had your hand up and I might have ignored it. Sorry. So
That's right.
Did you want to say something?
It really goes back and touches on the list. It really is what is the process that this committee is required to go through when it sees this sort of material. And I apologise to a certain extent. I could have assisted in leading you a little bit further through that. And Chair, you touched on it, is what is the impact of the likelihood and the consequence? And I touched on it in my earlier comments. It's where that is outside council's risk appetite that this committee should be concerned. And as we've all discussed, you'll never get these assumptions correct, but what this committee needs to understand and how much scenario planning it does is if the impact, as Rhiannon touched on, if a significant event occurs, are you satisfied that that council response, in essence, is sufficient to ensure that you stay as close as you can to within council's risk appetite, but more importantly, council's risk tolerance. And there's a number of risks in here which, when you look at the table that the chair referred to, force council to revisit its long-term plan. Now, to my mind, and this committee and council might form a different view, if you are having to rework your fundamental document to adjust for something that occurred, then that occurrence is outside your tolerance. And it's a concept we haven't discussed here, but risk appetite is sort of what I'll adopt. Risk tolerance, once you hit that, it's where it hurts me. Risk tolerance, I have to put my rates up 15%. I'm not going to tolerate that. Therefore, what mitigations do I have in place? What is council's response to ensure that we never hit the risk tolerance? And that's the conversation that this committee really needs to be focused on in terms of, we've got some risks here. Most of them we won't be able to control. We won't know what inflation will do. We'll put our best estimate in based on all the information available, but we know we'll get it wrong. What is the consequence of being wrong on that and a number of things on our risk, not appetite, because we've adopted our appetite when we accept that. When does it start to hurt our tolerance? When would we say we need to put in place mitigations, more mitigations, to ensure that when this risk is eventuates, it doesn't hurt us? And that's really the focus around this committee in the response. So do we scenario plan? Yes. With some of the population growth where it goes down, yes, that hurts the community, but to put it bluntly, it doesn't really impact council that much. Population growth is more likely to hurt us more because we would have to expand and spend more money to enable that to occur. Population not growing hurts the ratepayer because the individual ratepayer might have to pay more, but council's in relatively a neutral position. Sometimes our expenditure risk is worse than our revenue risk, if that makes sense. And it's understanding all those things and saying, okay, looking at that, accepting what the risk is, and the easy one for me always comes down to something like, if you look at inflation, I mean, it's going to be moderate and moderate, which puts it outside our risk appetite, because our financial risk is only moderate. Those two things put the risk, when you combine them, at high. Okay, we can't change that. We can't do anything to reduce that risk lower. What are we going to do to mitigate the impact when it occurs? And that's where this committee needs to my mind, needs to be focusing not so much about the assumptions, which is what everyone said. They'll come up to this committee from somewhere else. But what are we doing about those assumptions? What's our response to particularly where they're outside our risk appetite?
Thank you, and that's why I asked my question. Andrew, I think you already hinted at. Rhiannon, I think you've got some comments you'd like to make.
Oh, I was just going to speak to the Deputy Mayor's comments about the economic forecasts. So yes, that is why it's really important to think about the extent to which the assumptions that have been produced by Infometrics that underlie that plan are sound, and to be aware of where they have signalled there are some lower levels of certainty. I think they are fairly certain around the TY forecast. Obviously that population numbers, they take into account the broader, the whole economic picture. So it is the whole scenario with the TY change layered on top. So that's important to be aware of. If the agricultural sector does worse than expected in the model, it is expected to tail off a little bit, and we don't get some of the new industries, then no doubt we will be in a different situation than is forecast in those scenarios, and that is a risk that council should be aware of.
Thanks, Rhiannon. Rangi.
Just want to make a comment about how short sometimes our memories can be, and just looking back through media comments and going back to 1993, and the comment, last one out of Invercargill, turn the lights out, was a strong saying. The forecast was doom and gloom. The house prices at an all-time low, and well, I put it down to dairy coming and providing that intensification. But so if you look back to 1993 and what council would have sat around the table and talked about, everything was completely out of their influence, and you had comments like that. And if you look at where we are now, we are analysing these risks, but they are nowhere in comparison to making. I don't see any statements from you, Rhiannon, about switching the light out.
Except for managing our emissions, councillor.
Our emissions.
Carbon.
Switch the
Our carbon. Now, don't get me started on that.
That was a joke explaining.
Yeah. But anyway, I'm just saying that we need to, a little wee bit of looking back at where we have been and where we are. And you can, I think someone mentioned about over planning risks. I'd be more, if I was Queenstown Council, I'd be more worried about AF8, because there's a 75% chance it's going to go before 2050. So, this paper is very good, Rhiannon, and I think it's, as people have mentioned, it's something for us to talk about. Yeah.
Thanks for that, Rangi. Look, and I sense we probably where we are. And indeed, I think I'm hearing from the committee, firstly, in terms of there being a range of assumptions. I think their comprehensiveness and the analysis is one that is probably happened last time, but it feels incredibly good, Rhiannon. I actually want to pick up not the emission. Well, it could be the emissions, the environmental section. When I look at that, even if I'm thinking short term, with change in weather patterns and flood risk, or whether we're thinking long term, there is a sleeper in the middle of this. And I don't know whether I would quite agree that I'm a bit more negative about the consequences that we may face. My personal view, and I'm not a weather forecaster, necessarily, or anything like that, or an environmentalist in the sense of an expert. And I just wonder about our assumptions around this, and it comes back to the scenario modelling. What is the possibility and the downside? So look, I leave that as a question, because I would like us to move on. Rhiannon and Andrew, I think if there's two things then that we've discussed, one is mine around scenario, and it aligns really with your view. What situation could get us to an intolerable position, Andrew? I think the second one is, Tom, I take your point, you've made a strong bid that this needs to be workshopped, and I think probably the rich discussion that these assumptions generate in terms of those scenarios tend to be the area that you are starting to go. Starting to have a reasonable discussion that isn't one for this committee. It's actually one for you and your planning committee as to what is most likely and where you are going to pitch this LTP, along with having some range of possibilities, which will be normal when you're dealing with these assumptions. Okay, so I'm not going to necessarily put a resolution here that we have a workshop, but I do want, Michael, team, you've heard a call from the section of the committee, and I'd ask that you consider, is there something other than this just being received and then going up to two other committees adequate from what you've heard in terms of the discussion today? So am I comfortable, committee, that we move to the recommendations? Right? Thank you. Let's move to them. We receive, we note the progress for the adoption, and you've got a piece of homework to check out where our auditors are with their LTP, and we note, and well, I thank you for your feedback. We've noted that, and we can move on. I'm going to move that from the chair. Do I have a second to thank you, Leslie? Appreciate that. Is there any discussion on the motion? I'll put the motion, all those in, oh, sorry, Novi?
Just one thing I've been thinking about. Grant raised an issue there before. It just seems to me that this document drives where we go in our long-term plan, and it doesn't give us some insight into potentials for some issues we have in the community to be resolved by way of joint ventures. So I'm going to do a councillor-only meeting shortly to give my colleagues a bit of an update where I'm at with the housing issue, which Tom and Leslie are well aware of. But there's huge potential for some of these issues to be resolved in partnership with government, and certainly in partnership with local developers who have a different way of operating than us just being at the front and resolving our issues and then standing aside. Not sure about what we can contribute, but there's some potential there. I just think that our long-term plan often just encourages us on what we can do, often in isolation what we could be doing in coalition or partnership with others. So I don't know where you take that issue.
Well, I think
to a long-term plan.
Maybe I like what you're saying, and I think many councils around the country are thinking about how do they address the results of what comes out of this. And it's a bit, I mean, I want to pin what you've said back to what Andrew said, and what I've tried to say. What is the most likely outcome, and what could be the range of possibilities? And you've expressed that well, Tom. Because actually, we probably will feel uncomfortable at some of those scenarios. So you come back to, so what can we do? And hence, some of the questions you're doing is that, some of the points you're making is potentially starting to give some of those mitigations, which makes us more comfortable as we face what are the consequences or the risks associated with these assumptions. You got a good bunch. Yes, Rhiannon.
I just want to note, Mayor, and you might want to think about whether you have further feedback as we evolve these, but under the housing assumption, which is about the housing supply rate increasing from 0.5 to 0.7, that is based on the plans that this council has intending to do in terms of changing to the district plan. Known future developments and proposed partnership projects is built into that assumption. So it would, if those don't eventuate, then that assumption should be pulled back. So it's just, we have factored those things that you're thinking about.
Chair, I was just thinking a bit more longer term, that we tend to end up with a long-term plan, which is just what we are going to do.
Hear your point.
And I've heard other councils very much now focused on joint ventures that realise that there's more players in the field than us.
Well, you've done it down the road here.
Sure.
For a solution, I was thinking about it as I was running Queen Park this morning. Okay, we've got 3 resolutions. As I've said, there's a couple of other themes which I'm asking, particularly you, Michael, to think through with Rhiannon about approach. I'll put the motion. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Those against, it's carried. Could I move us to the resolution to exclude the public? I then intend to take a 10-minute break. Here goes the resolution. We've got 4 matters, 5 actually. Obviously the minutes, health and safety, litigation update, the financial risk update, which is really a report back on compliance, and we are going to look at the draft annual report. If we were to flick up a wee bit, Liz, or down, there are the reasons why that is the case. I'm going to move from the chair that we move into public excluded. I'm comfortable for the reasons that are stated there. To have a second. Thank you, Grant. Is there any discussion on the motion? There being none, I'll put it. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against, it's carried. Brilliant. Thank you. Can I suggest we take a break, get a cup of tea?